Ever wondered how much punch a 4-cylinder can really pack? For those new here, welcome to the realm of my 330i, true powerhouse flexing over 500 horsepower. Today's agenda isn't just about pushing limits, it's about redefining them. We're entering into territory usually reserved for the B58 6-cylinder. What's on the spotlight? This intake manifold upgrade. It's not just a part, it's a pivotal piece of engineering key to unlocking the full potential of this B58. Join me as we delve into the transformation journey, showcasing how a small displacement engine can achieve legendary status. Let's get started. Battery is disconnected, starting by removing the engine cover, removing the ECU cover, removing the ECU. I'm plugging all these connectors for the power distribution module. Removing these 210s. There's that piece removed with the power distribution module in place. Push on these two tabs and lift up. Same story here. Pull, lift up. Gonna remove this. Sound deadening. Unclip. Undo the electrical connectors you find on top. Going after this evap line. Removing this T20. Go down to do the 3 T30s for the charge pipe. Snapping this out of here. Going after the throttle body electrical connector, removing the throttle body. All right, be ready with the drip tray under the car. You're gonna lose some coolant. Pop that one off on the underside. Going after the intake manifold bolts now. They're captive inside the manifold, starting up here. Going to remove this so I can get access to the first bolt. So if you guys have been following along, you know that I have a port injection plate installed. So if you look at the new manifold, there is no place to put port injectors, so we're going to be retaining the plate. There is a place to put meth injection or nitrous injection. You could take these out and then feed into each cylinder that way. I'm going to transfer over the gaskets now. Now, to avoid heat transfer between the cylinder head and this intake manifold, given it's made of metal, there's a phenolic spacer or a heat rejection plate that comes with the kit, and it's going to need to have its own gaskets installed inside before you put it on your car. So I'm going to do that now. You can get these online or at your dealer. That's the part number for it. So that'll just sit there for now, and then we place the manifold on top of it. Any heat that builds up on the block and gets up to the cylinder head is not going to be transferred to the manifold, which will help with IATs. So I just popped that off of the pump, focused in on the other part of that line. I removed that line from here, that way I can take the whole thing up and out. The whole line was removed so we can get access to that clamp and cut it. So chances are you're going to nick the end of the hose, but you can always cut it a bit short if you ever want to reuse it. Alright, the reason we did that was so we can insert this line on here. Like so. We'll wait to tighten that down until we get everything in the right position. So that line's going to need to be modified as well, but I can modify it near the front of the car and then tuck it in there. So we're ready to put the manifold in place, but I'm going to show you some of the features on it before we do so and explain some of the benefits you can expect from it. Alright, so here's a closer look at the manifold. I did opt to get it powder coated. As you can see, this is billet aluminum. There's a look at the core. Approximately 14 inches by 5. Looking inside the stock core, it's under 12 inches wide and the height is about 2.5. So we're looking at, let's just call it 12 by 2.5 versus 14 by 5. But according to the manufacturer, it is approximately 80% bigger. So there's going to be a few benefits to consider. Of course, you have the strength of this being billet. If you're going to run high boosts, then having a metal intake manifold is going to allow for you to push further. Because this is larger, you're going to have to put in more coolant, and therefore you're going to have more capacity in the system overall. And besides the efficiency of all this, you're just going to have more liquid available, so it would take a longer for that liquid to be saturated with heat. I'm also going to be adding in this heat exchanger in a future video, which is also about twice as large or more than twice as large. So you have the volume of coolant you're going to be able to add because of the capacity of this and the manifold. So as you can see, the charge air coolant reservoir is quite small. You're not going to have a lot of space to put extra coolant to avoid saturating it. You only get the capacity in the stock manifold plus the capacity in the stock heat exchanger. So believe it or not, getting an intake manifold upgrade like this wouldn't just benefit an upgraded turbo. It'll benefit even a stock turbo. The stock turbo can make around 300 wheel horsepower. If you really push things, it can make 320 wheel horsepower. The reason it doesn't make more is the air density and the heat that would happen after 320 wheel. But if you were to cool that through a big intercooler core and reduce that temperature coming out of it, you're going to be able to make closer to 350 wheel. So it's like you gain 30 wheel horsepower potential. Ultimately, we're just upgrading the intercooler. It just so happens to be air to water and it's integrated in the manifold. In the past, you could just get an upgraded intercooler by itself and have it at the front of the car. The main question is, why does this only make 320 wheel when the one I have on my car now, which is a hybrid bigger version of this, why is that able to make 480 wheel? It has to do with the fact that the turbine housing can only work so hard. You can only close the wastegate so much before all you'll get is hot air, because as it's trying to compress this air in this small housing, the air molecules are bouncing off each other, you're getting friction, and you're just creating heat. And when you have a small opening out of here, that also makes the problem worse. And when you feed it to a stock manifold, you get more restriction and more compression because there's less space for it to cross through, there's less volume to be able to remove the heat, so you just hit a wall. Your wall gets raised a little bit higher when you can reduce the temperature of the charged air. So if you're trying to get your car ready to eventually upgrade to turbo, maybe doing this first could help you benefit along the way. When you go with a bigger compressor housing and a bigger turbo, you can make more power. The opening's larger, there's more volume of air coming through. So therefore, if you had a small core, then you're going to get pressure loss, you're going to get loose throttle response, you're going to just have a turbo that has to work a lot harder to overcome the manifold in the small area in there. Also, you don't get the heat removal because there's only so much volume to be able to extract that out. So when you open the straw up here, now you've made the straw narrow here on a stock manifold. Now this is a bigger straw, it's going to be able to get more air inside your engine. Now with my hybrid turbo with a little bit bigger straw, it is able to feed the manifold and it's able to get the air in there and make good power with it, but my IETs are high because at the end of the day I'm at the top end of the compressor efficiency map. My main goal here is I'm not really worried about the restriction of my stock manifold. It will help with throttle response and the wastegate duty cycle to have a turbo have less restriction in the manifold, but the main reason I'm going to benefit is the IET drop. I should see at least a 30-degree drop. I should gain at least 10 horsepower, probably 20 horsepower, and maybe even 30, but more like maybe 20 wheel horsepower. And I'm just going to have less strain on the engine because cooler air is coming out of the intake manifold, less timing corrections, etc. But in terms of wastegate duty cycle, when there's a small straw here, you can overcome it by asking the turbo to work harder, spin harder, overcome that compression. And then that means your wastegate duty cycle is going to be tighter. It's going to be more maxed out. So that means you're going to generate more heat inside the turbine side of the turbo, burning up seals, shortening the life expectancy. So even with my setup, I'm going to prolong the life expectancy of the turbo because on the wastegate side, it's not going to be closing as much to be able to overcome the restriction that would have been there with the stock manifold. So really, it's just pairing it with a more appropriately sized setup. Back in the day, you would have needed to upgrade your intercooler as soon as you started to tune it, but nowadays with water to air setups, they're more efficient. You don't really need to upgrade it until you're trying to push to a certain power threshold. In my case, it was probably 450 wheel. So with my upgraded turbo and the stock manifold, if I was aiming for less power, it wouldn't have been so much of a factor. If I was going to the track and racing, then it would have been a factor regardless. So that's the gist of it. The stock intake manifold isn't really a restriction in terms of CFM. You're not going to have a huge pressure drop across a small core with a stock turbo. The issue comes with the stock turbo when you're compressing the air too much, trying to get too many PSI out of it, out of a small compressor housing. By the time it leaves here, the air is hot. The hot air enters here and there's just not enough volume to do anything with it. But it's not going to be a bottleneck in terms of overall airflow because the CFM you're passing through it isn't really a restriction. So the CFM coming out of here wouldn't overwhelm a stock intake manifold, but the heat would. When you put a bigger straw and you have big volume to remove the heat, then you gain power. So there's two reasons to upgrade your intake manifold: to remove heat because your turbo is too small, or to not be a restriction if your turbo is too big. And in my case, it's a little bit of both because I pushed beyond what it was rated for slightly. So it's a little too small now and it's a little too big for the stock manifold. That's why you never know, I may gain more than 20 wheel horsepower. Just as an FYI, the cost of this intake manifold is similar to the cost of the upgraded turbo. But to get the most out of the upgraded turbo, you're going to have to do a bunch of supporting mods like port injection, reflex, and all that. If you're just looking to spend a couple $1,000s and you're asking yourself, what can I get the most out of right off the bat? It would still be the turbo because you can just run the turbo at less PSI. But it's not irrelevant to say that there are some people that probably have their stock turbo maxed out. They're not really ready to put a few more $1,000s into all the other supporting mods that would be required, but they just want to eke a little bit more out of the stock turbo for now. then you go with this first, have it removing heat and adding 30 wheel horsepower. When the time comes, then you can upgrade your turbo. And so basically it's relevant to consider this with a stock turbo, depending on the circumstance. There's a feed line from the pump. It seems to be appropriately length. It's not too short, so I'm just gonna leave it as is. It doesn't really bump up against anything in this area, and it's not getting kinked up, so I can leave that be. The more flexibility here is probably better. I made sure that I oriented the clamp inward, because if I had it out here where it could be easy to screw in, it's gonna bump up against things. It's pretty tight there. You want this to be as flush as possible. On the drain back, which feeds the heat exchanger, I want it to be able to tuck in under here and not get kinked up. So that means I would want to cut this short. I could potentially leave it long and kind of have it just kind of pinch a little bit, but I'd rather have it clean and run this way to feed the stock line. So I'm going to cut this short. So I'm mounting the clamp in such a way that it wouldn't be fun to get to unless you're going to pull the manifold, but that's okay. It could be this short, it doesn't even matter. I'm just going to keep it as long as possible. So those are nice and flush now. They're not going to interfere with anything. So I just moved that line behind. I reconfigured the feed to the port injection plate slightly so that it won't interfere with the manifold as I'm putting it in place. For anyone wondering about oil changes, there's a relief on here to be able to get this out still. Even with the spacer and the port injection plate, I got room to get that out. Now I just pulled the feed line up. Just insert it on there. Starting this by inserting it here. That puts everything in the orientation it needs to be. Let's get this inserted onto the pump. Let's check the routing of our feed line. A couple things I want to do just to make sure that it never contacts the belt. I'm going to cut this about that much short, a little bit less than an inch. And then I'm going to zip tie right around here to the AC line so it can never get close to the belt. Bringing over the map sensor. Now I'll start plugging things back in. So the kit comes with a coupler. Are you going to be cutting the drain back to the heat exchanger short? I'm going to route that over there to be able to mate it. There's what that looks like. I'm going to tuck it down now. Bringing over the throttle body. You're not going to use the original screws because they're different. They go into plastic. These are machine screws. And plug in the throttle body. Now we can reconnect our charge pipe. Given this is spaced out slightly more with that phenolic spacer, I'm just undoing my clamp here and moving the charge pipe more this way. You would need an aftermarket charge pipe if you have the port plate and this manifold. So unfortunately, this particular line is not going to be able to connect to the manifold. There's nowhere to put it due to the core size. So you may have to talk to your tuner about a CEL if you get one. You can do vent to atmosphere or cap it off, but just keep that in mind. So I just inserted a screw in here to be able to pop my original engine cover in. If you haven't already noticed, I'm going for a theme on this car, discreet. I'm going to go ahead and get the ECU reinstalled. I'm going to start filling the reservoir. It just takes regular 50/50 BMW coolant. From the factory, they put in a yellow coolant that has the same specifications as the blue, just so they could differentiate in case there's a leak, just FYI. So I've let the car idle for a while. I've done multiple fill-ups and it's been taking the coolant. So naturally bleeding while the engine is idling. But now that I've added the majority of the coolant, I'm going to initiate the electronic bleed procedure now. All right, so I have the car on the battery charger. As you can see, it's bleeding. You can hear the pump running and you can see a bunch of air bubbles coming out. It's going a little more aggressive than it was just running. So what I did was triple tap the start button, turn the headlights on, turn the temperature all the way up to high, put the fan speed to low, floored the gas pedal for 10 seconds, and then I got that pop up. And then you could hear both electronic water pumps running. So it's busy purging the air out of the system right now. I'll keep adding coolant as necessary, and then once it says service function ended, we'll know we're good to go. You can see how aerated that fluid is. The pump is working very hard. All right, the service function completed. It still looked a little aerated, so I'm going to run it one more time. Looking good now. The bleed procedure is done. All right, a bit more of a traditional DIY. A lot of you guys were asking for that. FYI, this manifold will also fit an F3330i, so I'll put a link in the description. As discussed previously, expect a DIY video for the heat exchanger. Thanks for watching.